with the ESC of the Western Reserve, and also wear an ELA hat a good period of the time of my work life, and ELA is actually one of my passions. So very happy to be with you here this afternoon. Dr. Brian Drost and I are going to be sharing with you some ideas around ELA assessment design. This is something, quite honestly, I wish I had learned probably 20 plus years ago when I started my career. So you'll see the title of the presentation is A Psycho Meets an ELA Teacher. I'm going to claim the ELA teacher, so we'll let Brian carry that psycho title there. But really it's looking at how psychometricians and practitioners come together and work on assessments and the principles we need to know for ELA assessment design. Brian, anything you want to add to that?
That was a great introduction. I'm happy to play the role of the psycho today. Every room needs one. So with that, all of our materials that we share with you today are free and open and accessible to all of you. We've created a live binder where you can access these things. We'd ask you to have a web browser tab open to this tiny URL that says tinyurl.com/drostassessments. Again, that's tinyurl.com/drostassessment, and it's going to bring you to a document that looks like this. We're working on ELA in this session too, but you'll see there's some math stuff up above. If you're interested in math, you can always come this afternoon and learn more about math as well too, because the principles of design between those are different as we go forward. Please make extensive use of the chat box. We're happy to kind of work with you. I guess a little bit about my background. So I'm one of the central office directors for the Rocky River City School District and play a consulting role for the ESC of the Western Reserve. And Tricia and I have run this presentation all over across the country to help teachers in their understanding of how to go ahead and work with language arts assessment materials. And kind of our title derives from the fact that kind of Tricia and I, the first time we met at a conference in Denver where she was carrying a mutual colleague of ours around on an iPad, and I'm sitting there talking about assessment babble, and we figured out we both live in the same state. And so with that, we share with you what we learned about working with ELA pieces and parts. But for those of you who are asking for that tiny URL in the chat box, it is now there for you.
All right, so you're going to want to go to that tiny URL because we're going to start in that live binder looking at a document that you'll see a little bit more than halfway down the table of contents on the left-hand side, and that's called Standard Shifts. When you open that, you're going to think, oh, we're looking at the wrong thing, but there's actually 2 pages. So we want the second page of that, which is College and Career Ready Shifts in English Language Arts and Literacy. So we're going to start with this. And what I'd like you to do, even if you're familiar with this, if you've seen this before, is go ahead and take a look through it and identify what you would consider to be the key words within that document for each of those 3 shifts and their explanation. And we'll give you a few minutes here to do that right now. In another minute or two, we'll start discussing, and I'm going to be asking for volunteers to unmute themselves and share keywords or phrases that you might have selected. And I'm not afraid to cold call if I need to. So just letting you know that I'll be asking for some volunteers to share. All right, let's hear some of those keywords, key phrases that you found as you read through those shifts and their explanations. Let's start with the first one, and then we'll go from there. So someone please grab the mic, share what you found.
This is Maura. So complexity it's important. I think the thing that jumped out for me was this staircase of complexity phrase and how it's building, you know, starting at the lower grades and building in complexity to the higher grades to promote college and career readiness.
Great observation. That's often one that comes up. That's one that jumps out to me too. And that's one of those things that it always makes me think with the work I do around literacy about what do we do? How do we handle it when a child isn't working well on that staircase, especially early on, and how that can really have an impact on learning gaps. So another idea, any other key ideas or phrases from complexity? Don't be shy.
I like the fact that it brought up vocabulary. That's always a big topic of conversation that we have in our chats that we have with ELA teachers. So I think that that last part, focus on academic vocabulary and words that appear in a variety of content areas. I think that that is extremely helpful and important for us to remember.
Thank you, Katie. That's an excellent observation. Great point. And definitely one that we need to keep in mind is we're not only working on assessment, but in a whole host of things that we do as educators. Anything else jumping out with you for you with that first standard? Or shift, I should say, not standard, sorry. All right, let's move on to the second one, looking at the one around evidence. What are those keywords or phrases that stood out to you with the second shift?
I think the the focus on students being able to present careful analyses and well-defined or well-defended claims are two key areas that I believe are important as we think about the shift in the standards and preparing students for college and career readiness.
Thank you, Kurt. Great observation.
This is Dina. I would say the writing to source stands out.
What makes that stand out to you, Dina? It's a great observation too. So what makes that stand out for you?
So the fact that you use the evidence from the text, and it's not something you would know without having read the text, and for us, our students have difficulty citing that evidence in a way that shows that they have read the source. So getting it from reading it to writing it.
I was working this year with the third grade team in one of my school districts, and that was one of the questions we spent a fair amount of time talking about. They're really working hard to get those students to use evidence from their texts. And of course, this is third grade, so it's our first time into the state tests and all of that for them too. And one of the things the teachers said repeatedly is it's so hard to keep them focused on evidence rather than jumping off into the story about their uncle's pet turtle, or pulling in things they've learned from their trip to the zoo or whatnot. And it's not that those things aren't worthwhile to know about, but we don't necessarily always want to include them in a written response, or at least not as the primary evidence in a written response. So great point. All right, let's look at that third shift of knowledge. What are those keywords or phrases that stood out to you in that particular shift?
I'll jump in here again. This is Maura. So the important thing I see is that 50-50 balance of informational and literary text early on, where we're learning to read, and as we shift to more informational text, making sure that they have an abundance of rich text to read from.
Thank you, Maura. That's a great point. And if you've been yourself an English language arts teacher, or you work with them a lot, you know that this one sometimes can be a challenge for language arts teachers, especially those of us who are trained in the world of secondary ELA, because for an awful lot of us, we went into ELA because of a love of literature, not necessarily a love of informational text. So that can certainly be a challenge. Any other observations of keywords or ideas within this particular shift?
I think to piggyback off of that is looking at the 6 through 12 grade band and the greater attention and focus on literary nonfiction within this area of informational text. So specifically really honing into literary nonfiction and being able to, as a teacher, understand what that is and what that looks like, and how we can provide kids with opportunities to engage in rich literary nonfiction text.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Kurt. And the really cool thing is how much of an explosion there's been in literary nonfiction, especially for kids in the younger end of that 6 through 12 band. In the last probably 5-6 years, there's just more and more good stuff that's been shared. So let's take a look at our next slide, if you don't mind, Brian. And these are those 3 shifts, which we've just looked at. One of the things that I love about these 3 shifts is they're embedded in just about every single thing that we do within the English language arts classroom. And so, yes, we have multiple standards, but those 3 shifts really encompass what's going on within all of those standards. So we want to think about these in terms of where we want to put our efforts as educators, not just in terms of the text that we choose, not just in terms of the lessons that we design, but we really want to think about it in terms of the assessments that we are either writing or using. So we want to think about them across all of those contexts. And honestly, I think they can be helpful when we're having those discussions, especially with parents. Parents are not necessarily going to know what RL 4.5 is, but they are going to understand when we say we're really looking to build knowledge and we really want students to be able to read complex text that's appropriate for their level and their grade level and their age and all of that, and also build that knowledge through reading, because they're not going to go through life with somebody following them up with a PowerPoint and a 10-minute lecture. So we need them to be able to do these things for themselves.
So you might ask us, well, why did we start here with this piece of information? And there's actually a psychometric reason for why we started there when it's all said and done. This is where the ELA teacher meets the psychometrician. So just like whenever you've probably worked with kids before, you just can't like cut off their heads and look inside to see what they know and are able to do. You have to base it on something. If we're talking lesson design, we base that on learning objectives. If we're talking assessment design, we're basing that on what are called claims. Interestingly enough, in our United States system of education, our claims are always rooted in standards in this country. That goes back to, you know, No Child Left Behind, even before that, with Goals 2000, where states had to go ahead and adopt standards for themselves. The interesting part about this is Ohio's standards are built on these three claims. Interestingly enough, when we look at the reporting data that comes out of the Ohio reporting system, that's the information we get when we start to look at claims. And so when we start to build assessments that are aligned, and especially when we're talking about criterion reference assessments, we have to use these three criteria in order to determine the alignment between the item as well as, you know, the actual assessment that we're giving for kids. Another fun fact is, if you've ever done any of the work with the former AIR, now Cambium, we use those same three things when we're determining what's going on. So when Tricia mentioned complexity up here, there's this handy dandy word right here that says and. Oops, sorry about that. It says the word and it's academic language. That means when we start to look at questions and we start to devise those questions, we have to have a complex text. In our state, we know what those are. They're defined by Lexile level. You haven't gone to the back of your standards. Feel free to check that out. There's a whole big giant chart that tells you where we range those at. And then it has to have tier 2 academic vocabulary words. Those are words that have multiple meanings in multiple contexts, things of that nature. Our questions are going to require kids to use evidence from the text. And I made a comment before in the chat box that it's not just about citing evidence anymore. That was kind of like shift 1.0. Now we're actually asking kids to actually use that evidence to do something with it. And then from there, we have that building background knowledge. And so as Tricia mentioned, many people know that I'm a big fan of the classics, especially Shakespeare. This doesn't mean that we're not going to still teach Shakespeare. It doesn't mean we're not going to assess on Shakespeare. It means that we're going to go ahead and use pieces of evidence or pieces of text in a text set format that allow us to build background knowledge. So I always use this example when I'm working with my teachers. If I have the choice of using an excerpt of Romeo and Juliet versus Julius Caesar for purposes of an assessment, I'm going to choose the Julius Caesar every time. The reason being is it gives me all that historical knowledge and context that I can apply to another nonfiction text that are going to help support students as they move forward. So those three pieces in part essentially become our Bible when we start to build the assessments. I'm sure you've probably already heard or seen these things before, but just as kind of a reminder, in our pre-AIR Cambium days, we were working on little emphasis of text complexity. We didn't really use tier 2 vocabulary words. We were working on definitions of figurative language. Now it's not so much about the definition of figurative language. It's now, can you explain why the figurative language is used that way in the context of a passage? Do you understand how the tier 2 vocabulary word makes sense in that passage? I think about the first time that I was exposed to this type of thinking, and I remember being in Boston Logan Airport. It was July 3rd, day before 4th of July. This was about 7 years ago. And I had a sample that we were working through with the Park Consortium. And I'm in the airport, it's a hustle and bustle, and I'm trying to read this passage and answer the questions. And honest to God, I could not do it. Then I pulled out one of my old-fashioned OAA assessments, And I was like, oh yeah, I can answer these with all this background noise. I now actually had to read and understand what was going versus just knowing the dictionary literal definition when it was all said and done. And then of course we mentioned the lifestyle piece. It's no longer about simple recall or superficial analysis. And this is where I find teachers get frustrated because they pull out of their curriculum resources, and I'm not picking on any particular one, but let's just say Wonders, for example. You pull those Wonders assessments that come at the end, they're all recall. They're all superficial analysis. They don't get kids to the careful reading and analysis of the text. They're not always necessarily using strong emphasis, and they're definitely not writing to sources in most cases. So that's the idea that we have to start to shift when we look at assessment design. And then of course, as we mentioned, we have that balance between the literary and the informational text that has to happen. And that's really where the concept of a text set comes in as we start to work and think through things. So that being said, we're going to take you through the process we've used with teachers to go ahead and support this, because I don't know your experience right now, but if I tell my teachers to unpack the standards one more time, they're going to lynch me. They just don't want to hear that anymore. But what I have found is that if I can gauge this in something that they do care about, whether they like their test scores or not, they do care about them. So this is a way that you can go ahead and get teachers to actually figure out what's going on in the standards, as well as build something that they can use for high quality student data going forward as we start to enter into an OTES 2.0 mind. So what we're going to ask you to do is go back to the live binder that you have there. And we're going to ask you to click on the link that says ELA 1. And it will bring you to what is called a grade 5 informational mini assessment. So we'll give everybody a second to do that. Once you get there, I want you to scroll on down, forget all of this in beginning stuff. You're going to even scroll right past the passage. And you'll see question 1 on your screen there. Or if you're following along in the live binder, you'll be at that point. What we're going to ask you to do is think about those 3 shifts and start to apply them to questions. We're going to do this twice. This first activity that we're going to do is, these are all really good questions. These were written by English teachers, they were vetted by psychometricians, and they all go back to that blueprint we have, those 3 shifts in our head. So that means that every single one of these questions has to get us at that 3 parts to this shift. And so that's our first activity. We're going to do this one out loud. When we go to the second one, some of them are going to be good and some of them are going to be bad. And then our third time is we're going to show you how we write these so that you can get them in an aligned mode when it's all said and done. So I'm going to do a kind of a talk aloud for this first one here. So it says, what is the best definition of the word impact as it is used in paragraph 1 of the article? And what are the 2 ways that the word impact helps develop important ideas in the article? So this is a 2-part question. And so we have to evaluate the whole question. We just can't use part A, we just can't use part B. It doesn't work like that. We'll see why that is here in a minute. So if I think back to my shifts, the first one was that I had to have academic language. I need that tier 2 vocabulary. Well, if I look at this very first part of that, I've got the word impact there. Well, that's a word that's used in multiple cases. It could mean any of those. Without me having to read the text, I have no idea what the correct answer to this. Here's a little tip from the psychometricians. We're really good at using dictionaries. When we find those words, we just pull up the dictionary and write the 4 meanings there. That's how that works in that mark, so that we can get kids to actually understand what's going on in the text. So right there, we've met claim 1. Claim 1 is I had to have academic vocabulary tied to a complex text. Then my next one is that I have to have evidence from the text. Well, if I look at just the part A, I don't have any evidence going on there. That's the reason why we have to have a part B. If I just stopped with that part A, I wouldn't have anything to go with. I wouldn't be proving my claim that I'm supposed to claim as an assessor. So when I look at part B, what are the 2 ways that the word impact helps develop important ideas in the article? Well, now I've got to use evidence from the text. I not only have to know what that word means, I've got to be able to figure out it in the context of that text. And you know what, those psychometricians, they're making us find it twice, not just once, but twice. So they're really having to prove it. And that's where we get into the stretch of the of a test. Then the last part to that is, well, are we building background knowledge? Without us even going into the passage, if you just start to look at the answer choices here, you'll start to see that we've got things about deep craters. We've got things about the moon. I've got a context that I can apply somewhere else. So I'm building that background knowledge. If I didn't do all three of those things, if we were at the state level, that question would be thrown out. It wouldn't go any farther. When we start to work with classroom teachers, I'm usually happy if we can get one of those two parts just to start with. Then we work on getting in the second part and then eventually the third part, because it does take time for them to do that. I can tell you my own experience in our district. We rewrote our English language arts course of study 4 years ago now. We've been writing assessments 3 years running now because we always find something more that we can add that really gets to where we want the kids to be in terms of the shift. So I'm going to ask you to take a look at the second question here. And I'm going to give you a couple minutes to read through it. Do the same thing that I did, and then we'll ask you to unmute your mic and share out what you think about that one. Remember, this is a good question. So if you're missing something, you want to dig in a little bit deeper. All right, we're going to ask you to go ahead and share out for us. Where do you see evidence of academic vocabulary, evidence of using evidence, and then the building of knowledge in this question? So I see that Moore has written in the chat box, the strongest reason is evidence. So yes, they're definitely having to read that article and then find the reasons in that article. And so they're actually using the evidence. We're just not asking them to cite. So that meets one part of that. How about the other part, the academic vocabulary? Because remember, this is a good question. We have to meet all three of those things there. So what do you see in there that's academic vocabulary? You can either chat it out or unmute yourself and tell us. I see Julie mentioning the word investigating. Yep, that's a good one. We've got vocabulary that's used in other content areas, as Katie mentions. That's absolutely right. We're looking at that tier 2. We can also pull words from the choices as well, like the word probe, for example. A science probe looks very different than the probing we do in mathematics class. So, I mean, that's another one that can happen. So definitely we've got academic vocabulary there. And then the question becomes, are we building background knowledge by doing this? I mean, unless you're the kid out there that knows everything about the moon and how the waters form, more than likely we're going to be building background knowledge for the kids at this grade level when it's all done. So it works. So as you go through, you can see that we've got all of these questions that meet that criteria. If not, this would not be a good assessment. This would not be one that would tell us how students are performing in relationship to the standards. Now, in this particular case, see that if you go back up to the table of contents, we've actually identified what specific standards are actually happening in this particular assessment. I'll give you a little psychometrician tip. Standard 1 and standard 10 are always going to be there. Without a doubt, it doesn't matter the grade level. It has to be, because remember, the first standard at any grade level is about using evidence. Well, that's one of our claims. We have to see that. Then from there, standard number 10 is about that we're reading on grade level. So defined as Ohio defines that using the Lexile level. Standard number 10 is always going to be there. And then more than likely, standard number 4 is always going to be there, because we have to check on vocabulary. If you look at this chart here, you can see that I've got 1 and 4 already. 10 is listed down at the bottom where they explain how the Lexile was determined for this one. And you'll see that there's 4. Then they've targeted 2, 3, and 8 for the rest of this particular assessment. there is a writing piece at the end, and that helps us get to the writing of sources. And so that's really one quick, easy way to help your teachers build the assessment. They know that they're going to have 1 in 10. So we choose a piece that's on grade level at the appropriate lexile level. We know we're going to build some questions that relate to, evidence. We're going to have some vocabulary questions. And then from there, we have to really think about the standards we're actually going to use in order to measure. In my district, we've identified those based on our units of study. So some units we're targeting, standards 2, 3, and 6. Some units at 7 and 8, so forth and so on. We can, of course, build this in the context of a text set, which is what we do. So we have reading for informational tests and text, and then reading for literature when it's all said and done. So we're going to ask you to jump a little bit. We're going to ask you to go to the one that's marked ELA 2. Okay. I note this at the top because I've had districts and people call me back and say, well, we gave that test and it didn't work out and it didn't tell us what to do. This is not a good test. This is a practice test. It's a practice activity for purposes of making sure we understand how to write good questions. So as we go through this, some of these are going to be good questions. Some of these are going to be really bad questions. It's really your job to find the bad questions. So in the live binder, we're going to ask you to go to ELA 2. Remember, you don't have to read the passage in order to analyze the questions. That teachers love that. It saves them time automatically. And so what we're going to ask you to do is take about, we'll give you about 8 minutes or so, maybe 7 minutes, to go on through and start to find the questions that you think are bad questions. And then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about that. Trisha will lead us through that. So take a few minutes, start to read on through which questions don't get us at evidence, which questions don't get us at vocabulary, and which questions don't help us build background knowledge. I will tell you that this is at grade 5 for purposes of this activity.
right, just in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and start our discussion. So if you don't mind, let's start with question 1. Brian, you might want to scroll up a little bit there on your screen so we can see question 1. And love for someone to take the mic and just talk us through, how do you see this one in terms of the 3 pieces we're looking for? So academic, language, evidence, and building background knowledge. Go ahead, someone take the mic, talk us through what you're thinking.
So I'll chime in here. I was looking for bad questions. So this one looked good to me, and it looked good to me because it looked like it was building knowledge. And it appeared to me that it had the components of evidence, because I couldn't answer it without reading the text. And as far as vocabulary, I don't know, that's a little questionable, but obviously it's related to the concepts that are written in the question. So again, it makes it hard to answer if I haven't read the question or comprehended the question.
And the vocabulary aspect of this question is one that kind of is a question mark for a lot of us when we look at this one. The one word that I think can help us with that is wind, because is that wind or is it wind? Because we could read that in 2 different ways. So that might be one way to consider that piece. So, all right, how about let's go ahead, and if anyone knows of, you found a question you think is bad, what's one of the questions you would say, no, it doesn't hit all 3 of the things we're looking for? Laura's showing number 3. Anyone agree with her? Either put in the chat box or take the microphone and explain. Kurt's agreeing. Why is number 3 not a good question? Because you're right, it's not a good question. Why is it not a good question? Yeah, Katie, where is that academic vocabulary in there? Recall, yes, you've got it. And how is that building background knowledge? I suppose some people might argue it does. It lets you know that there's multiple parts to the wall of a bubble, but no, it's not a good question. That's not a good one. Any others that stood out to you as bad questions? Laura's showing number 5. Anyone agree with her? And if so, why? I promise it's okay to take the microphone and talk, really and truly. And I also understand why we're always reluctant to, but it's okay. Number 5 is another poor question. What might be the reason behind it?
So I see tier 3, specific vocabulary to the English language arts classroom only. Although it hits vocabulary, it's a tier 3 kind of a vocabulary. And there doesn't seem to be, it's not strong in using evidence. You're just very low level recall.
There's not the use of evidence, and it's really going back to the kinds of questions we used to ask. What is the figurative language device used in this sentence? And so really doesn't even require going back into the text. So those are a couple of the bad ones that we had in here. Brian, do we have time to go any further, or do we need to move on?
I think you can do one more, Trisha. I don't see why not.
All right, so let's take a look and see, is there one that you're on the fence about? You're kind of like, oh, I think it could be good, but I'm not willing to bet a cup of coffee at Starbucks on it. You can either type the number in the chat box or turn on your camera and show us, or take the microphone and tell us. All right, Brian, what's one of them that historically we've had groups of teachers that have been on the fence about?
So historically, Trisha, one that always comes up is number 8 in this particular case. It's the one I have on the screen right now. So it says using information from the article. That's true. Describe what is the same and what is different between big bubbles and small bubbles. First question we pose, is that building any background knowledge whatsoever? I mean, let's think about this as, you know, a general human being. Do we ever really need to know the difference between big bubbles and small bubbles? Probably not for purposes of everyday living or applying to other locations. So it doesn't necessarily have that building background knowledge. But then when we go through this whole thing, there really isn't even any academic vocabulary going on in that question. I mean, we could really easily adjust that by doing like similarity and difference, or changing other words that are in there to go ahead and do that. And then from there, even though it says using information from the article, kids are going to know some things about bubbles already. So are they relying on the text, or are they relying on actually their background knowledge? So that might be a consideration where we might want to go ahead and make some adjustments with that.
And there are a couple really good points in that. Probably the biggest one for me is just thinking through how, when I'm looking at an assessment I might want to use with a group of students, a lot of people have picked up on that needing evidence from the text, and they've taken questions that don't necessarily align to the 3 shifts to begin with, and then they'll add that phrase, using information from the articles. And that's really all that's different. And that by itself is not going to make it meet the shifts and the criteria that we need for it to be a strong assessment question. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's something to watch in terms of writing our own assessments. And also, if you're using assessments from other resources, just keep that in mind when you're looking at those questions.
And Trisha, you brought up a really good point there about looking at other resources. I have to laugh because we know how change is slow in education. And I finally had, this was a week ago, probably my team that is my most, they're probably the best teachers I have in the classroom, but they can be the most resistant when it comes to change. When it's all said and done, they shot me an email and they said, you know, Brian, we finally get it. You've been beating this into our heads, you know, for 3 years now. And as we started finding free resources online to help us with online instruction, we were like, yeah, this doesn't measure what it's trying to measure. It doesn't actually get us at our standards. So instead of giving busy work, I've got teachers now that are really taking the time to look through things, to go ahead and support things. So as we kind of wrap up here in the last 4 minutes, we want to show you our process for how we go about actually writing questions, because it's great if we can find them. We can go through this process pretty simply. Well, what do we do in the cases where we can't find what we need, or we need to go ahead and actually write something? So the first thing we have here for you is this handy dandy list in the live binder here that's called the cheat sheet. It takes you through the process that we're going to talk about. And so that's there for you. So you have to have some type of unit that's going on. What are we assessing on? So you have to figure that out first. So if you don't have a unit, it's probably not the smartest thing to do to start by writing that assessment first. Then from there, you're going to want to choose passages. We chose, for purposes of today, just to show you one single passage. But good, solid assessments are going to have 2, because you're going to have some that are from reading for literature. You're going to have some that are from informational text. And you want to pair those together. You're going to then organize the text to figure out which text helps the student with requisite background knowledge first. Put that one first. That's going to help them understand the next article. One of the cool things about our AIR and our Cambium tests is the questions are put in an order relative to the passage to help kids make sense of the passages. Gone are the days in language arts where you want to tell kids, well, if you don't know that question, jump to the next one. That probably won't help them anymore because those questions are put in order to scaffold them through the passages. The best tip you can give them is go all the way to the end first. Check out that writing prompt because that writing prompt is going to pull from both of them. That way they have a guide in their mind of what they're actually looking for. Then from there, you'll start to write the questions. We highly recommend writing questions using the standards resources that are on the AIR portal. If you go to that handy dandy website, and I'm going to try and click on it here, hopefully it'll come up, you'll see that it brings you to these documents that are called test specifications that are right here at the top. If you click a particular grade level, like for example, I've got grade 7 up, and I scroll on down, I can find example starter stems of what a question will look like in relationship to the passage. This is where I find teachers tend to struggle the most, is they're not sure how to start writing the question. They know what to ask, they know what questions, they know what standards. That's the easy part. The question now becomes, well, how do I write that question? This is a really simple way to help them get into that thing. And then when they're all done, and you'll see the last thing on the checklist, if it'll come back to me here, maybe not. The last thing that's on that checklist asks you to go back through the process we just went through and analyze what you just wrote. Do you have questions that use academic vocabulary? Do all the questions require your students to use, not just collect the evidence? And do the questions lead students to make sense of the text, or in areas where students often have difficulty in building background knowledge? And then really quickly, you have a really fast way to build a quick assessment to really check on student learning in relationship to our state standards. We've also provided for you one other additional resource. This is an ELA checklist. If you have a team that's really struggling on actually, they've used the ones that are the sentence stems that are already up there and they want to get a little bit more creative, this checklist here will help them analyze the questions that they start to write. It's a lot of yes or no type things, but it's kind of like a gatekeeper. If when they go through and they get a no for anything in section A, that's not the question to ask. It's not going to play out correctly for the students. It's not going to evaluate or show the information on the standards. So I do believe it is 1:20. If anybody wants to go ahead and ask us a couple of questions real quick, we're happy to entertain them. And then if not, we are set to go off to our next session, which is at 1:30. I will make mention that we do have a blank one here for you. If you wanted to try and start to make your own questions, you could. Well, I can speak on behalf of Tricia. We've known each other quite long. We're glad that you've been with us today. If there's any other additional questions, we'll hang out for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then I know everybody's got to get off to their next session. So long, friends.